Welcome back to the Critical Moves podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about asymmetry in strategy games with my best mate in the world, which is Jack. No, sorry, it's Timothy.
Oh, sorry, Jack. But hey, how you doing?
And very, very special guest who's here for his performance review. It's Jack.
Fan favorite here with Alan, his best friend, Tim.
Yep. Thanks for joining us, Jack. I know this was last minute because we were let down by somebody who shan't be named, but is Portuguese. We were going to do something different, but we've decided last minute that we're going to look at asymmetry in strategy games. So this is completely unrehearsed, unresearched. Let's get into it. Tim, it was your idea to talk about this, so why don't you kick us off?
I would say unresearched, just not unresearched, just unresearched for this episode, right? I think we've played enough games to know a thing or two about it, and it's something that I certainly find incredibly interesting, asymmetry in video games, and something I think about regularly when designing video games as well.
So a couple of weeks ago, you was interviewed by Jack along with Patak. What's his name? How do you... Taku.
Exactly, Jack remembers. It means bird in Polish.
Jack was on the episode. I also think that Klingon, Patak.
I speak fluent Polish, actually, so.
I speak fluent Klingon, so it's absolutely fine. So it's funny that you mentioned game design there anyway, Tim, is what I was getting to, because I'm not being very serious, and I apologize. Beyond all reason, I've mentioned it, you don't have to. How does asymmetry work in that game? Because on the surface, it's built off Supreme Commander, which I would say was more symmetrical with its two factions than asymmetrical.
Well, to correct you, it's actually built off of Total Annihilation. Like, that was the direct inspiration, not Supreme Commander. It was like developed alongside Supreme Commander. But yeah, it's
Did I say Supreme Commander?
You did, yeah. I guess it tried to move a little bit away from the hyper-symmetric of Total Annihilation and try to... We do nowadays find a little bit more asymmetry. There's a third faction coming up as well that looks to be very different. But that creates its own unique problems. And I think that's a big question in general, to have how much asymmetry you have in a game, because it does create like balance issues if you look at something competitive, or fun issues if you look at if one faction is just a lot more fun than the others, and so on.
And I suppose that's always going to be the reason why factions are not asymmetrical. I'm going to hate saying that word after a while, but that's always the reason why I guess developers have steered away from asymmetry, because in terms of balance, it's very easy if you just have red army and blue army fighting each other. Is it worthwhile putting the time into balancing and development to bring asymmetry into games? What do you think, Jack?
I think it depends on the game itself, which I feel like is the answer I give every time somebody asks me a question on this podcast, is that it depends on something. But it does, really, right? Because that's what video game design is, Tim. You make a game with different factions, and depending on what you're adapting, you might very well have different resources from the source material for what those factions use, or like the history of that world. As for an original idea, would it be worthwhile for a developer to put that in their game? I think it would, if it actually serviced what you were doing. We've talked with multiple developers on this podcast before, and they've always approached their game design with this idea of building off of older games or being inspired by games that they play all the time. And most of those games are strategy games with symmetry. Some of them feature key strategic resources, but most of them don't have these separate resources that are that much more important to one particular faction. And I think it's kind of disappointing, because it's always fun when you main a particular faction, and when you're playing multiplayer or playing through the campaign and you choose like a particular perspective for that faction, and then you know that you have to play differently because the maps have different resources or something like that.
Yeah, I guess I often approach it from the competitive point of view, and then when I look at like very highly competitive video games, strategy games that have come out, something like StarCraft, for example, they have very asymmetrical factions, like the Zerg, Terran, and Protoss are designed in such a way that they construct buildings differently, they have extremely different units, so on. And then when you look at people enjoying watching these games, for example, or even playing them, they enjoy it a lot more when it's different factions fighting each other than the same faction fighting itself. And I think that shows a lot about what people enjoy both playing and watching. And in a way, it's less competitive to have the asymmetry because there are some advantages, and then some players would win a match depending on the map because the map was favoring one faction over the other. So it diminishes a little bit the competitiveness, but at the same time, I think there's a large amount of merit to it.
So I suppose if you have a faction which is navy focused and you have a water map, they're going to do better than they would if it was a desert map, aren't they? To put it into simplistic terms.
Yeah. And StarCraft, what it was like, for example, the Zerg factions needed to expand more. So if it was a larger map, they would do better, and they'd have the transportation as well with the Nidus Canal and stuff like that.
It's quite interesting because I guess I always thought of asymmetry as being something which is quite modern, quite recent. But you mentioned StarCraft. I mean, we talked before we hit record on this about Red Alert with the differences between the Soviets and the Allies, and the informational asymmetry that you had with those two factions. But it even came down to, with that particular game, you had light, medium, heavy, and mammoth tanks, and the light and medium were Allied tanks, and the heavy and the mammoth were Soviet tanks. So you had this asymmetry in the main attacking unit, as well as informational asymmetry as well. So asymmetry has been with strategy games ever since they started, hasn't it? Jack, I mean, if you think, and I know we covered 4X a lot when we did the episode last week with Explominate, but I suppose that you see asymmetry in more than just RTS games, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's throughout the entire games industry, or just games that we play in general. There's, I mean, you talked before we started filming about chess, that being the original strategy game, and there's a clear advantage for white to go first, right?
I suppose there is, yeah. But in terms of, it's a turn-based game, somebody has to go first. And in terms of any kind of asymmetry, well, there isn't any.
But it's always white, those bastards.
Bit racist.
Oh, my bad.
But no, you're right. That there is, I guess, even with what people would consider to be the most symmetrical of strategy games, which is chess or anything like chess, even in something like that, because white always goes first, there's always an inherent advantage. So yeah, there is a, I didn't really think of that. There's asymmetry in the most symmetrical of games in that respect.
But interestingly, in chess, whether or not the game has symmetry or not depends on the competitiveness of it. If you're playing two casual players, whether you're white or black matters not at all. Like there's practically no differences in chances of winning if you're a very casual chess player. If you're like a very hardcore chess player, it changes the game completely, going from trying to win to trying to draw and not lose, which I think is kind of interesting how that changes the whole aspect, because then it becomes about David versus Goliath in a way, and that sort of asymmetry I find very interesting in strategy games.
I mean, does going first give you such a huge advantage? Is there any
in
kind
top level chess? Yes, like
Yeah.
the grandmaster pros, they don't play one game of chess anymore. They play like a series of 7, and then every time you're white, you're trying to win, and every time you're black, you're trying to draw the game such that the enemy doesn't get a win.
So it's like tennis.
Sure, if you say so.
Well, in tennis, whoever is serving, that's a game
Oh,
which they should win.
I didn't know that.
Because they're going first. They get to hit the first ball, determine where it goes. In a lot of, particularly men's tennis as well, grass court tennis, games could be won by a top server just by hitting 4 or 5 serves, and the opponent never gets a chance to return a shot. I guess there's parallels in sport as there is in strategy games as well.
Interesting.
So I suppose you would look at tennis and you look at chess and you think these are very symmetrical. It's one person against one person. But there's even asymmetry in the smallest of things.
But then what I find even more interesting is when the rules of the game are completely changed for the different factions. And I'm thinking something like, I don't know if you've heard of this game AI War.
Yeah, we interviewed the developer.
I know.
Did you not know that?
I did. I'm joking. Like if you've heard about it,
He's
because we did
promoing now.
an episode about it. Or for example, something like Terra Invicta, you play a very fragile, small faction that is up against this overwhelming alien force, and it feels like you're a little bug that can be squashed at any time, but you have to try to grow just a little bit in the shadow and try not to attract like the dangerous huge Goliath that can look at you wrong and crush you in a way.
I suppose XCOM's like that as well, then, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah, and then the asymmetry even seeps into the theme of it. It becomes more than just what faction are you playing, but the theme makes this feel asymmetrical, like guerrilla warfare as well and stuff like that.
So I came into this thinking, well, there wouldn't actually be that much asymmetry in strategy games. I mean, I know there was some, and we've already talked about examples, but it goes a lot deeper than what it would appear on the surface.
Yeah, and I think if you watch it along that theme, it's an extremely popular theme, even in movies and so on. You know, the little man, the big man kind of thing, and it comes again and again in games like High Fleet or campaign maps for strategy games where you have to fight an overwhelming force, and because the enemy has way more units than you do, you have to be smart about your tactics and you have to play the game a little bit differently and so on, even in campaign maps.
So I suppose the difference, or rather the point of asymmetry, is to strike a balance between a perfectly balanced game, which, as we've discovered, even in chess, one side goes first. But I suppose in RTS, both, if you had GDI versus GDI, nobody has a particular advantage.
Yeah.
So it's striking a balance between having that kind of setup and having something where there's interesting choices. Even as little as when you play, if you played, and I'm sure you did, Command and Conquer Generals with the GLA, didn't use power at all. So that was a very asymmetrical faction. Whereas you might look at a war RTS game and think, well, there's going to be very little in the way of asymmetry in that. But I suppose we see it everywhere, and it's only when we actually take stock and sit still and start interrogating these systems that you see the asymmetry come to the fore.
To kind of build off of what Tim was just saying a moment ago about the reasoning for asymmetry in games, I love a good opportunity to talk about Halo, but I brought this up on the podcast before to you both about Halo Wars 2 and Halo Wars 1. Despite being pretty evenly balanced real-time strategy games, they take into account the lore that both of you are unfamiliar with, which is very briefly that the Alien Covenant and the Halo series is overwhelmingly powerful in all naval space battles. I believe the human fleet has won like 1 or 2% of all space encounters with the Covenant across all of the Halo media, which is probably inaccurate. But regardless, it was only land-based combat encounters in the lore that the humans would ever succeed in because they had their super soldiers. But Halo Wars takes that into account with the general like technology differences, because while it's based on other strategy games and takes a lot from their DNA, it's a base management game. You're essentially putting a forward operating base down, upgrading that, and then creating units to send out to destroy somebody else's forward operating base, like Age of Empires or something akin to that, which is more so just one empire versus another, but you're essentially trying to build forward operating bases as like a crawl across this usually symmetrical or sometimes asymmetrical map. But my point being, the Covenant have access to shield generators and cloaking devices to hide their buildings, while the humans have access to long-range siege turrets. But in general, in land encounters, their units are sometimes cheaper to make because we're talking about an alien covenant that's subjugated dozens of weaker alien races to be slave warriors. And so it's just interesting, right? Because it's building on what we were talking about before, how especially if you're adapting something or you're creating an original game in a franchise or something like that, you're kind of both taking in the lore, but in gameplay and competitive wise, in Halo Wars, I believe it's pretty well understood that in high level Halo Wars competitive gameplay, the Covenant side comes out on top on the first few tiers because their land units are better and their buildings they're capable of having every upgrade on a single turret, for example, where humans can only have either an anti-air or an anti-vehicle or an anti-infantry turret. So it's things like that from a game design perspective that make asymmetry interesting, even in real time when you can't necessarily try to map out the other player's moves like chess or something like a 4x game when we would have discussed something like asymmetry.
Yeah, you have the same in Dune Spice Wars, for example, where you have the spice that different factions use differently. For example, the Fremen don't care too much about spice, whereas the Guild use it for movement and so on. And then you have the voting. Different factions have different voting. So it incorporates the lore because that's also really how the lore explains these different factions as well. So yeah, that's interesting, but yeah, it makes it a lot harder to balance. And then when I'm thinking of if I'm playing a game and it's either very symmetric, like chess, or like GDI versus GDI in Command and Conquer, or something like that, or I play an asymmetrical one, it plays differently. It becomes a lot more about execution and am I executing better than my opponent versus if it's asymmetrical, you're trying to leverage specific strengths or attack specific weaknesses or try to leverage those. And it's a different kind of thinking, it's a different kind of it's something else.
Is there a risk in asymmetry that you fall into? And you mentioned this over the episodes you've been involved in, Tim, which is probably most of them. Rock, paper, scissors. As in faction A can defeat faction B can defeat faction C, and faction C can defeat faction A. Is there a risk with asymmetry that you fall into that particular cyclical system?
You had that a bit in competitive StarCraft. What I've noticed a lot of RTS games in the 2000s and Beyond No Reason has that as well a little bit, is that you first create two factions that are quite symmetrical and very similar, but they have some small differences. And then the expansion pack comes out with the third new faction, but they're like, oh, let's add all of the new cool weird mechanics to that faction, and then that faction feels like so very different from the other two factions, and then it gets a bit that faction feels very symmetrical, but then it doesn't fit what the previous game was doing with the two identical factions.
And there's a risk that developers will subconsciously do that in terms of, because they, of course, they want to sell the expansion pack, of course, so they make the new faction superior to the traditional factions, almost accidentally. I'm sure they're not going to go out of their way to unbalance games, but I suppose that there's a risk that the new faction, if you look at, and I don't think it's come out yet, on Tempest Rising, you've got two factions, and they, when we interviewed Brandon Castillo, he talked about the Veti, the third faction, which I think is going to be released as an expansion, a DLC or an expansion, as like a playable faction. There's a risk that in order to shift numbers, they make that the faction that everybody wants to play as. And is that a risk that all game developers have to be aware of? Do you have to be aware of this with what is the new faction called? Is it the Raptors for
Legion?
Legion. Where am I thinking Raptors? What's that from?
Raptors is the PvE enemies, and that's another interesting. Like you have like turret defense kind of games where one faction is kind of attacking and the other faction is defending, and Bar has that with the PvE mode, I guess. But no, the new and released faction is Legion, and yeah, I think part of it is also, oh, we have the established factions, we can't change them too much anymore, but we're now making something new, and like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if they had that? Wouldn't it be cool if we could add this? And these creative outbursts come out and you want to implement them. and I think that that's a big cause of it. And I get it. I mean, it's kind of cool to come up with new mechanics. It's kind of cool to, oh, what if in the game you could do that sort of stuff.
But are you very conscious of the fact that you have to put balance at the heart of everything you did? I mean, when I interviewed one of the Sanctuary devs, and they talked about they have 3 factions to start with, and they were saying that it's balance concerns are exponential when if you introduce a 4th faction. It's not just not just 25% more. You've got to balance that against every other faction and every other unit, and then if you added a 5th faction, it becomes huge, and before you know it, it becomes something that you can't control. So as part of the dev team for Beyond Our Reason introducing Legion, you have to be very conscious of the fact you don't make them overpowered because, oh, we can do this, we can do that, we can do all these exciting things, whereas you won't change the 2 core factions. They only get incremental changes, adjustments, balance adjustments. But you have this opportunity to bring in something shiny and new. And do you run the risk of making them superior to the existing factions? Almost an accident?
I think it could almost be better to release them underpowered and then incrementally improve them, because that way you don't get this effect of like, oh, a new faction is super overpowered, and then you have to bring them down, and then that feels kind of bad that the cool stuff has gotten weaker.
But at the same time, you don't want to introduce a new faction too underpowered so that they get trounced all the time, and people say, well, what was the point of that?
But then you can make them stronger, and then people feel better that their faction is better than the way it was before. It's a good feeling. In general game design, I'd say it's good to buff things rather than nerf things, because people like this idea of like, oh, now it's stronger, nice.
Mm-hmm.
But if you nerf it, people are like, oh, it's not as strong as I used to.
And I want to get away from the situation where I interview you, because Jack's already done that, but 2 weeks ago. But Beyond Our Reason as an open source free to play game doesn't have the same risks attached as, say, we've mentioned Tempest Rising. So when they release the Veti faction, they have to be very, very conscious that it is balanced from the start, because if it's released too OP, the people who enjoy playing as the original factions are going to be pissed off. If it's released underpowered, nobody's going to buy it. Beyond Our Reason has the luxury of not having to worry about the bottom line. Whereas if you are a game developer, publisher, whatever, that's putting out an actual product for sale, you've got to be on point. You can't do what you're doing. You have the luxury of releasing things underpowered and then buffing them to bring them up to standard. They don't have that luxury, do they?
And that's why I think games made by gamers is a lot more fun than games made by shareholders.
You would say that, wouldn't you?
I would.
Jack, you mentioned Halo Wars there, and you mentioned the lore, and it gave me an interesting thought, and that's Empire at War, the Star Wars RTS from, I think, 2006. Because in the lore, you've got this ragtag band of rebels against an overwhelmingly powerful galactic empire. How do you rationalize balancing that in a strategy game?
Because you've played it, right, Jack? You've played Empire at War by now, right?
Yeah, retroactively, by the time this episode will have come out, Tim will have finally played Empire at War with me. He's promising on this episode, him and Adam. Al would never play Star Wars with me. I mean, I'm no game designer, but I would imagine that you would approach it similarly to the same way I talked about Halo Wars approaching adapting lore from novels and games that already showcase these battles, right? I mean, in Star Wars, I had seen the original trilogy, I've seen the prequel trilogy. I know that the rebels, while an underwhelmingly small force compared to the Empire, are ragtag because they generally come up with plans to disable armaments that the Empire has, or they're usually running intelligence operation missions to counteract the overwhelming force of the Empire. The Empire has really strong players. It has Darth Vader, it has Emperor Palpatine. So the rebels, I mean, they have, by the original trilogy, they really only have Luke. The way I would kind of imagine balancing that is you would have to design the ships and systems of the rebel force to probably be faster and more agile and possibly obtain certain intelligence resources that reveal the fog of war of the map depending on the type of gameplay better, while the Empire has these slower moving ships with far more armor and health. And perhaps, if it's a game with progression systems across the gameplay, the Rebels probably have to do something over the course of the match to unlock the ability to destroy certain ships easier or certain primary targets, while the Empire probably has to, have their own resources or upgrades to defeat a rebel force. But that's the player's perspective on those things. That's why, to me, asymmetry makes sense for certain mediums, because it doesn't make sense. There's no star destroyers in the rebel fleet. There are cargo ships and transport ships that they're refitting for this intergalactic war. That they're, so it to me as a player, I would rationalize that it has to be asymmetrical for something like that, and that's at least the first approach I would make if I was some wonderful game designer that worked for Beyond All Reason.
If you have those two factions, which faction would you want to play as?
I'd probably play as the Rebels, not because they're the good guys or because that's what Al would play as, but because I'm not one for... To me, I like progression paths, or at least to me, in the example I gave, I would want to play as the Rebels because they just sound more fun, a more agile and like intelligence-driven side, or at the very least, a side with ships that aren't overwhelmingly powerful. There's probably a meta there to succeed, or some kind of path that you have to particularly follow. That's the kind of thing I would choose. I would only choose something like the Empire if I was trying to learn how to play the game, which I think is a lot of the case for these games with asymmetrical battlefields, right? There's like usually a particular faction that's better at teaching the game if it's that asymmetrical.
So in Empire at War, how it's balanced when you're talking about a campaign map, not like an individual skirmish, because in a skirmish you have it's a lot more symmetrical, even though the ships are a bit different and so on. You start with the same resources and so on. But on a campaign map, the difference is that the Empire starts at the center of the galaxy, and the Rebels know exactly where they are, and the other way around is not the case. So the Empire doesn't know where the Allied bases are, doesn't see them, doesn't see the movement and so on. And then the Allies, the Rebels rather, they can send in from the darkness basically into attack any side of the Empire. And they can send in spies and steal the credits and so on from the Empire.
Well, that's way more interesting than what I'd said. How did you come up with that, Tim?
Well, I didn't make Star Wars Empire at War. I just played it.
Oh, with who?
Not you, or maybe you in the
okay.
future.
Have I missed something here? Have you got a date planned with
for ages, and we've been meaning me, Al, and Adam to play Empire at War, the three of us.
I'm not involved.
Yeah, you mean me?
No,
You guys
no, you're not.
this romance together. It's impenetrable.
Well, I think I couldn't tell you. I'd have to have a look to see which episode it was. But back in 2024, when we first started this podcast, we talked about Tim will remember this. We talked about a grudge match, a Beyond All Reason grudge match between me and Joseph. And when that was maybe episode 8, and we're now on to episode 48. So it was 40 weeks later, and it hasn't happened. So if you're relying on Tim, who's wonderful, if you're relying on Tim to arrange these things, Jack, it's just never going to happen, mate. It's never going to happen.
I know.
So just
I
grab
believe
Adam.
that was the episode for player versus environment.
Was it? Was that
Yeah,
what you said?
multiplayer versus single player. I think so.
Right.
I listen to all these episodes.
It's because you're a fan, isn't it? It's because you're a
I'm
fan.
a fan favorite, actually.
Well, actually, I think Adam is a bit busy and can't play. So Al, if you wanna play, we can play the three of us. I'm free next week.
Only if I can be the Empire.
Oh, you can, because with Empire at War you can play with 3, and then you can play with the consortium, like the trade league kind of people, and then that creates an interesting asymmetry again, where you have more than 2 factions, and then I think that leads to very interesting dynamics where there's like this balance of power through more than 2 points, which is kind of an asymmetry as well.
So this was the Forces of Corruption DLC, wasn't it, where they introduced the consortium? And in terms of the asymmetry between the Empire and the Rebels, how does the consortium fit into that as well?
They can spread corruption, and then as they spread corruption, they basically steal money from everywhere and like make other planets worse.
Where was that in the movies, Al? I said, where was the consortium in the movies?
It wasn't.
It was. It's
in Solo.
Excuse. It's no. It's the excuse that they use to use excessive power because the consortium is like being the bad guys, and that's how they gain power initially.
That was the Trade Federation, wasn't it? That was the.
Isn't that the same?
Well, no, it's a different name. Is Forces of Corruption canon or not? Anyway, we're getting off topic. This is not an episode about Star Wars because not everyone's a Star Wars fan, are they?
Thank God.
So we've talked about faction asymmetry. We've talked about map asymmetry, I guess, in terms of the StarCraft faction, which prefers the larger maps because they expand all the time. But also you have asymmetry in other things like victory conditions as well. And I guess this probably applies to your grand strategy games, maybe more than RTS, where a particular faction will be geared up towards a particular type of victory. Have you got any examples of that, Jack?
Oh, yes. I play Civilization multiplayer recently. I mentioned that in another episode, and I will stream my game, and my friends will look at my empire and let me know that I'm only generating like 100 culture per turn in like the late stages of the game. I mean, I'm full production. I think that's just what makes grand strategy interesting. We brought up Beyond All Reason. There's a particular 4X space-based strategy game that you and I like, Al, where the most intriguing part of the game is when an update comes out and provides another way to win the game with almost an undefined win condition, where you're just approaching it from a completely different angle because there's new mechanics within your empire. But if you're talking about an actual specified win condition, I mean, Civilization does it. Even without grand strategy, I would say Age of Empires, right? That was the original kind of win condition for real-time strategy at that level, where at least where people have played it so much.
Because I suppose the obvious victory condition is to destroy your enemy. Looking at Beyond All Reason here, you wipe out your enemy. There's no other victory condition in a game which is as basic as that. Whereas if you look at
basic.
Hey, you just choose to interpret my words however you choose to interpret them. Whereas if you look at Stellaris, see, we can mention the word now. We've mentioned Beyond a Reason a lot. We can mention Stellaris.
It's just getting ridiculous at this point.
It is. And, I mean, I can think of 3 different victory conditions just without, and I haven't played it in maybe 6 months. Not only do you have the total victory where you just wipe everybody out, but you've also got Become the Crisis, where you build the it's almost like a Dyson sphere type structure around your sun, and eventually I forget what the name is, ultimately wipe out all life in the universe. And then there's one which is shroud based, isn't there, where you become you ascend, or you again wipe out all life, but via the shroud. So there's differences in victory conditions in 4X games, but I suppose RTS games aren't really geared up towards having asymmetry in victory conditions.
Interestingly, Age of Empires started with exactly that. You could either conquest, or you could build a wonder, or you could collect all the relics, and so on. Interestingly enough, everyone that played Age of Empires would disable all of that and would put conquest as victory condition only because that's what they wanted to play, and they did not want to have this victory condition.
And Civilization has how many different victory conditions?
It has a ton. Interestingly, though, what I think with Civilization is you can't really have conquest as a decent victory condition in Civilization, at least not when it was initially made, because maps were so big and there would be like so many small little settlements everywhere that it would take way too long to try to conquer the whole map. I think that was the main idea behind it.
And I suppose when we're talking about 4X and grand strategy, and I know we said we didn't want to go into this. But look at Total War as well, as a quasi grand strategy game, where if you start so in Empire Total War, which is one of my favorites, but people tend to not like it as much. If you start as the UK, if you start as Great Britain, you have to capture certain provinces. You've got to capture the 13 colonies in Jamaica and certain other provinces in order for you to achieve victory by a certain date. If you start as France, you have different colonies that you need to capture. So I suppose there's asymmetry in those. And I suppose if you start as a less powerful empire, your victory conditions or what you would perceive as victory. And I think Drexy in our chat with him last week said that I guess there's like player determined victory conditions. So you may say if I'm Malta, then I might only want to capture the Barbary coast, and that would be to me my victory. There's no fixed. You must paint the map victory conditions in those kind of games.
Well, it would get really dull as well, right?
Well, I don't know, would it?
Because once you reach a threshold, once you reach a certain threshold, it becomes repeating the same thing over and over, and there's no more challenge to it. It just becomes execution.
And I suppose you need to. That's what they refer to as snowballing, isn't it? You eventually reach the point where you reach this critical mass where you become unstoppable. And I suppose that has to be something which is considered in balancing in all games, but I suppose especially in grand strategy games.
Yeah, and interesting, Age of Empires and Civilization, both of them also have the asymmetry with the Civilization, where I think what you mentioned is that the more civilizations you have, the more they need to be balanced to each other. But then both Civilization and Age of Empires did this thing where they kind of... Everyone has kind of a generic civilization with here and there some changes. Here and there. Oh, you have plus 10% here of that. You have minus 5% here of this. So it's not as grandiose of a change, even though it has big knock-on effects, even those small changes.
But you don't see, if we look at the difference between Civilization as a 4X game with 30 different leaders that you can take, or however many there may be, and you look at it compared to Supreme Commander with 3 factions, you don't see the huge faction variety in RTS games because they're limited in terms of what their victory conditions are. Whereas if you take a 4X game or a grand strategy game with asymmetry in victory conditions, you can have asymmetry in factions as well, because certain factions will achieve certain victories easier than what the Total War example comes in there, where if you're playing as a smaller empire, you only have to capture a certain amount of nearby provinces, whereas if you play as Great Britain, you've got to capture half the world, for example.
In Age of Empires, there's like 30 factions or so. Age of Empires 2.
Is there much difference between them?
Well, that's what I say about the same as Civilization, because you have like one unit that is their faction unit, and then like you have a plus 10% this or minus 5% there, and then like, oh, you can build this building, or you can't build this building. There's that kind of difference.
So there's a spectrum of symmetry. There's a spectrum of symmetry, asymmetry, from symmetrical, which is your GDI versus GDI, to your asymmetrical, which is I don't know. I can't think of an example off the top of my head.
I think AI War is like a very extreme version of that.
Yeah. So I guess it's a case of, you could almost say, well, whereabouts does a game fit on that particular spectrum? And when you're looking at games like Age of Empires with lots of different factions, and I suppose it's because you play as a particular nation or empire or whatever, you're going to have lots of them. You can have asymmetry, but you can't do it to the extent that you could in AI War because of the type of game that it is and the type of victory conditions that there are. So you can have your plus 10%, your minus 10%. You can have, you've got this particular unit. You've got armored knights. You've got horse archers or whatever, but you couldn't go overboard and maintain the mechanical integrity of the game.
So differently from other Paradox games, Victoria 3 has these almost predetermined scripted events that happen for nations, right, Tim? So is there a particular nation, as somebody who can't rationalize my business background and play Victoria 3 properly, is there a nation in particular that you choose that has a particular scripted event that is actually like a bonus to you at the beginning?
I think the nations have huge themes within the game, and they play extremely different. Like if you play Great Britain, you play as this like overlord that has this huge empire, and then occasionally your underlings, like in the Indian continent or Canada or something, try to rebel against you, and you have to fight them off, and you have to keep. It's like you're holding a whole bunch of, I don't know, limes, and you're trying to not drop any of them, and you're trying to be as greedy as possible. But then, on the other hand, you can play something like Belgium, and you're this like tiny little country in the middle of all these other great powers, and you have to make sure that you befriend all of them and you don't anger them. At the same time, you're also very technologically advanced, and you can get really ahead in manufacturing and focus really on the economic part and doing like a bit of a trade empire and so on. So yeah, it plays completely differently, even though everybody can make the same thing and everyone can have the same trade deals or whichever. They play so extremely different because the conditions, the lands that they have, the current laws that they start with, the current technology that they start with, and the neighbors they have, the context is so incredibly different. Even though there's the same tools available, the context is so incredibly different. And then it's the theme of it is just, even without any of the scripted events, even without any of that, it's already a very different experience within the same game, obviously.
Yeah, because my experience with that early on is Belgium, right? And there's a scripted event where you can be called for the London conference. And if you actually lose that London conference early on, you lose a portion of your nation, don't you?
Yeah. So you have to befriend the nations to make sure that they vote for you, basically. But no, the playthrough is completely different. And what I'm doing now, I'm playing with a bunch of friends actually, and we play Victoria 3, and then there's a lot of player-to-player diplomacy, and because we have different powers, because the nations that we play are different, or so someone gets ahead or something like that, there's this like tug of war diplomacy of like trying to get everything in check, and like if someone is getting ahead, like do they have to be kept in check or not, so stuff like that. That's really fun.
As an aside, because that's quite interesting, I'm just thinking about that. If you're playing multiplayer in a game which has diplomacy as a mechanic in it, do you have diplomacy outside of the game mechanics as well?
Yeah, we're on Discord. Yeah, we're on Discord, and then we're chatting, and then we're making deals and so on amongst each other. And I think with a game like that, it's almost required to have proper diplomacy, because most diplomacy in games, they're like click button, improve relations or something like that. That's not really diplomacy, That's not talking. And then like the voice talking is like such a huge component of actual diplomacy. Like, hey, I could give you something here, if we together we did this. This is diplomacy to me,
Yeah, so like at the start of the episode where I say you're my best friend in the whole world, so that it's diplomacy, right? That's, I just
Exactly.
sweet, you're sweet talking people, I'll buy you a
Where does the
pizza if
payment come?
you give me these units. I'll buy the pizzas. Yeah, I think you were going to make some reference to wargaming, weren't you?
Oh yeah, I mean, wargaming is really big on asymmetry as well, and that mirrors like the historical context, and there again, I think it tries to mimic the asymmetry that happened in real war, then the context is the biggest difference. What situation do you start off with? Are you like rapidly advancing and you have to make sure that you keep advancing and the enemy has to just try to stall it for as long as possible?
Reminds me of an episode we did with Shane back when he was part of the podcast, and he talked about war in the Pacific, and
Exactly.
you have the you have the Americans, you have the Japanese, and I think I can't remember the exact details, but something on the lines of, as the Japanese, you have to win almost immediately, because once the military industrial complex of the United States kicks into gear, if you haven't defeated the US by turn 20, you're never going to beat them.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's always that risk with is it a game called, is it Poland 39, which is like the Nazi invasion of Poland. I think that's the title. And I think Nuno mentioned it in an episode, and I was like, well, how can that be fun? Because how can, if you play as Poland, how do you rationalize balancing a game like that, which is based upon real world examples, when it was so overwhelmingly one-sided? And I suppose that there's a risk there of if you are playing historical war games, there's a risk that you will unpick history by bringing in too much balance. But at the same time, if it's too asymmetrical, no one's going to play it. It's not fun.
Yeah. And this is a really good question with historical gaming. Is like, yeah, that's a very good question to make, because okay, in the current world, those guys lost the war because they did everything wrong, or because their starting point of view was just bad and so on. And like, yeah, do you make it such that they have a chance of winning or not?
Or do you just make it so they have a chance of delaying the inevitable?
Wouldn't that be interesting? You play a game and you're bound to lose. You lose no matter what, but how do you lose?
It's interesting because I think there's a game which I saw recently which I think plays upon that exact premise, and I will confirm, but I'm fairly certain it's Yield: Fall of Rome, and you play as a Roman faction at the end of the empire.
Oh,
So
interesting.
ultimately, you know
Yeah.
that you because you can't undo history, so you know that the empire is going to fall. So it's a case of, do you have what it takes to hold off the collapse of the empire? Can you have a new golden age before the collapse? Is it going to be internal strife which causes your collapse, or is it going to be external pressures which cause it? So you're right. It's a really interesting method of making very clever games, and it's already been explored by some developers.
That's interesting. You called Yield Fall of Rome?
Yield: Fall of Rome.
Oh yeah, I see it came out last month actually.
I think it from what you're talking about there, where, as we said,
Yeah.
with Poland 39, it's a case of, well, no matter what happened, the asymmetry was such that the Poles would never have been able to defeat Nazi Germany in September 1939. So how do you make an interesting game around that particular setting? And this is another one. Rome falls irrespective, but it's like, what do you do to stave off disaster?
And interestingly enough, I see it's called online Yield Fall of Rome Review Most Relaxing Forex Strategy Ever.
If it's relaxing, it's doing something wrong, isn't it?
Well, I don't know, like just watch the world. Some men just want to watch the world burn, I guess.
It's like Frostpunk, but for culture.
Oh, there you go. Wow, that's a nice analogy.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose Frostpunk is another very similar game. I appreciate that there's no real asymmetry, because you're not fighting against anybody other than the
Nature.
environment. Yeah. But I suppose it's another one where you're just trying to stave off defeat.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, and maybe it can be something which we look at in a future episode, because we are going to have to draw proceedings to a close, gentlemen. because we're out of time. So, Tim, thank you very much as always. You're wonderful. Jack, thank you very much for dropping in at the last minute and saving our asses, because Mr. Portugal didn't bother to turn up. It is appreciated.
I know an episode with just Al and Tim wouldn't really do much for the channel, so
it would just be a love fest. It would just be a love fest.
I know. This impenetrable romance. Or romance. Drop the beat.
We would just sit here staring into each other's eyes and every so often.
Like you did on the outtakes of this episode.
Yeah. But fortunately, you were here to leech any libido which was there. So we appreciate it. Gentlemen, thanks very much. It's appreciated. This is the Critical Moves podcast. If you go to criticalmovespodcast.com, that's our main website. I've updated it, guys. Have you seen it? It's wonderful. You've got photographs of everybody but Jack on there, so you can see why Tim is my darling. You've got links to all of our social media, so you can check out shit that we post online, to the Discord if you want to come and have a chat with us, and detailed, comprehensive notes for all of our episodes. This is episode 48, so there's a lot of history there. Go and check it out, criticalmovespodcast.com, for all the ways to get involved.
Yeah, and you can also find our email address where you can send us fan mail too.
So come back next week, episode 49, where we have no idea what we'll be talking about. Hopefully, before we press record, we'll have some understanding, but at the moment, it's up in the air. We've been Critical Moves. Thanks so much for listening. Take it easy. Goodbye.